It is September 1977. Your dad has been away for 2 weeks, and the car has sat on the driveway the whole time. You walk out with him on the Saturday morning, and the thing is on the floor. The tires are all perfectly fine, but every corner of the car has sunk down until the wheel arches are resting on top of them. He looks at it and says the same thing he says every time, which is that it needs pumping up. He does not mean the tires, he means the suspension. A huge number of British cars in the 1970s were built with no springs on them anywhere. They had sealed rubber and fluid units instead, one at each corner, with the front of the car connected to the rear by a pipe, so that hitting a bump at the front pushed the back of the car up to meet it. If you left one standing for a fortnight though, the fluid gradually settled and you came back to a car lying on its face. You drove it to a garage where a machine that looked like a hospital trolley plugged into a valve and pumped the whole thing back up to the right height. Ask anyone who owned an Allegro or a Princess and they will tell you about the morning they walked outside and found their car on its belly. That is one of 10 features in this video that made 1970s British cars completely unlike anything on the road today. There was a small switch on the gear knob and most passengers never knew what it did. It was a switch marked Overdrive. You would be sitting in top gear on a dual carriageway with the engine roaring away at 4,000 revs, and then your dad would reach down, flick that switch with his thumb, and the whole car would change around you. There was a short pause, then a soft clunk came up through the floor, and the revs dropped away until the car settled into a long, quiet stride. What made it happen was a separate unit bolted onto the back of the gearbox, with its own gears and its own oil inside it, which raised the ratio whenever you asked for it. You could get one on the MGB, on the TR6, on Rovers, and on Cortinas, and then 5-speed gearboxes became normal in the 1980s, and the switch quietly disappeared. Under the boot floor of plenty of 1970s British cars, sitting next to the jack, there was a bent steel bar with a wooden grip on the end of it, and that bar was the starting handle. At the front of the car, low down under the number plate, there was a small hole with a rubber bung pushed into it. You pulled the bung out, fed the handle through, felt around until it caught the end of the crankshaft, and then cranked the engine over by hand. The whole business genuinely worked because, on a flat battery on a cold January morning, a reasonably fit man could get a Morris Minor running with 4 good pulls. There were rules to it, and every dad knew them by heart. You gripped that handle with your thumb alongside your fingers rather than wrapped around it, because if the engine kicked back, the handle came round the other way and broke your wrist. You also checked the car was out of gear first, and the men who forgot that watched their own car drive itself slowly into the garage door. Walk around a 1970s Jaguar XJ, and something looks slightly wrong, because there is a fuel filler cap sitting on the left rear wing, and another one sitting on the right. That is because the car had 2 entirely separate fuel tanks, one buried in each rear wing, and they did not talk to each other at all. There was a switch on the dashboard marked left and right, so you ran on one tank until the needle dropped, flicked that switch across, and watched the gauge swing straight back up to full as the car started drinking from the other side. It handed every single owner the same story. You would forget to switch it over, the engine would die on a roundabout with half a tank still on board, and you would sit there flicking away at that switch while the car behind you leaned on the horn. The Austin Maxi looked like the dullest car British Leyland ever built. It was beige and boxy, it had 5 doors, and it was about as exciting as a bank holiday in real. Then you pulled the lever on the side of the seat. The front seats reclined all the way back until they met the folded rear bench, and the entire inside of the car became one long continuous padded surface. You had a proper double bed inside a family hatchback, straight out of the showroom. Campsites in Cornwall were full of Maxis with a whole family asleep inside, because a hotel cost money and the car had already been paid for. Teenagers found their own use for it, and every police force in Britain worked that out fairly quickly. It sold badly and it looked like nothing, and it could still do something that no car in a showroom today will do for you. The mini boot lid was hinged along the bottom edge rather than the top, and this was completely deliberate. You could drop that lid down flat, load the boot until it was piled higher than the roof of the car, tie the whole lot down with rope, and drive off with it hanging wide open behind you. The number plate was hinged as well, so when the lid dropped, the plate swung down and hung vertically and stayed perfectly legal. Somebody at Longbridge sat down and thought that through properly. Early Minis had sliding windows rather than the winding sort, which meant there was no mechanism buried inside the door, which meant the whole door could be hollowed out into an enormous open bin. The story goes that Alec Isagonis sized those bins around a bottle of Gordon's gin, and the bottle certainly fitted perfectly, because plenty of owners checked for themselves. The first Range Rover arrived in 1970, and the inside of it was almost aggressively basic. The seats were vinyl, the floor was covered in rubber mats, and there was painted metal on show everywhere you looked. All of that was deliberate, because there were drain plugs sitting in the floor. When the inside got filthy, and it always did because this was a working car that spent its life on farms and building sites, you opened the doors, pulled those plugs out, and turned a hose on the interior. The water went in and the mud ran straight out of the bottom. Try that in a modern Range Rover and you are looking at a repair bill the size of a small mortgage. Then people with money noticed the car and wanted leather and carpet in one. Land Rover gave it to them, and the drain plugs quietly disappeared. Pull up behind a Rover SD1 or a late 1970s Jaguar at night in the rain, and you would see something that made no sense at all at first, because there were tiny windscreen wipers fitted to the headlights. There were two of them, each about 4 inches long, and they swept backwards and forwards across the glass as if the car had a second, much smaller face. The reasoning behind them was completely sound. Winter roads in Britain were covered in salt and wet grit, and it built up into a gray film across the headlamp glass within about 20 miles. Nobody ever thought to clean it off, so you drove around with headlights putting out half the light they should have been giving you. A wiper on each lamp cleared all of that in about 3 seconds, and children in the car behind absolutely loved them. In 1970, you could walk into a showroom in Britain and buy a bright orange wedge with 3 wheels and no doors on it whatsoever. The Bond Bug looked like a doorstop, and it stood about the same height as one. To get inside, you lifted the entire front of the car, because the canopy, the windscreen, and the roof all came up on a hinge in one piece, like the lid of a box, and you climbed down into the seat and pulled it shut over your head. The reason it existed at all was tax, because a 3-wheeler under a certain weight could be driven on a motorcycle license, which is why Britain built so many of these, and almost nobody else bothered. Everything so far has been a car doing something odd for a sensible reason, and this last one is rather different. In 1976, Aston Martin showed the Lagonda to the world. It was long, low, and completely flat, folded out of straight lines as though somebody had designed it with a set square and a grudge. You opened the door and found no instruments in front of you at all. There was no speedometer needle, no rev counter, and no dials of any kind. And there were glowing red digital numbers instead, the same sort you got on a pocket calculator, telling you your speed and your revs. The switches were even worse because they were touchpads, so you brushed a smooth panel with a fingertip and the car did something, with no click and no feel to any of it. This was 1976, and the family cars parked outside still had a knob on the dashboard for the choke. Aston Martin spent more money developing that dashboard than they spent on the rest of the car, and the first one arrived 2 years late because of it. Then it started going wrong, and it kept going wrong. So cars sat in the workshop, while engineers who had trained on carburetors stared helplessly at circuit boards. Every digital dashboard on the road today started here, in a British car, 20 years too early, in a workshop in Newport Pagnell. Put all of that together, and you get a decade of cars built by people who were prepared to try absolutely anything. From a suspension system with no springs in it, to a family saloon that turned into a double bed. Some of these ideas were brilliant, some of them were completely mad, and a few of them managed to be both at exactly the same time. If any of this brought a memory back, put it in the comments below. Which one of them did you actually own, and which one did you completely forget about until the second I mentioned it? Share this with someone who would remember it too, and subscribe to the channel to keep these stories alive.